The garage smelled like burnt electronics and expensive failure. 50 of the best engineering minds that money could recruit stood in a loose semicircle around a car worth more than most of their houses combined, and not one of them could tell the woman who owned it why the engine had gone silent 9 days ago and refused ever since to make a single sound. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of that semicircle in a work jacket, with his name stitched over the pocket, holding a canvas tool roll that looked like it belonged in a different decade, and the man beside the CEO looked at him the way you look at a stain on a white shirt. If you've ever been the person in the room who actually knew the answer, while everyone with more letters after their name argued past you like you weren't even there, stay with this one until the end. 10 days earlier, none of this had a name yet. It was just a car that wouldn't start sitting in a private hangar outside Stuttgart's American subsidiary campus, under lights bright enough to perform surgery. The car was called the Kestrel, a one-of-one build commissioned by Elena Voss, CEO of Voss Dynamics, a woman who had inherited a logistics empire from her father and had spent the last 6 years quietly turning it into something bigger, sharper, and far more dangerous to her competitors. The car had cost $5 million. It had taken the German manufacturer's Skunkworks division 14 months to build. And on its second week of ownership, driving it home from a charity gala, Elena had felt the engine cut out at 40 miles an hour, coast to a dead stop on the shoulder of a state highway, and never turn over again. She'd had it towed to the manufacturer's American Technical Center, a glass and steel building that existed mostly to reassure wealthy clients that Germany was, in some abstract sense, still involved. The man who ran that technical center was named Richard Kessler, and Richard Kessler had a problem, though he would not have described it that way. His problem was that he did not actually know how the Kestrel worked. Nobody at the technical center did. The car had been built by a small, secretive team back in Germany. A team that had since been dissolved, its engineers reassigned, its documentation scattered across systems that didn't talk to each other. Richard had inherited the prestige of being the man in charge of servicing a $5 million hypercar without inheriting any of the knowledge required to actually do it. So when the car died, Richard did what men like Richard do. He made it someone else's problem, loudly, and he made sure his own name was nowhere near it. He told Elena Voss that this was, quote, an extraordinarily rare diagnostic challenge requiring the absolute pinnacle of engineering talent. He told her that his own technicians had already exhausted every standard protocol, which was true only in the sense that they had exhausted every protocol they knew existed. And he recommended, with the smooth confidence of a man who has never once been asked to show his work, that she bring in outside specialists. Specifically, he suggested a partnership his division had cultivated with MIT's Mechanical Engineering Department, a pipeline of top graduates the company used for recruiting optics as much as actual labor. Elena said yes. She was not a woman who enjoyed being told the problem was unsolvable, and she had the resources to throw at it until it stopped being true. 50 graduates, most of them barely 2 years out of school, some straight from thesis defenses, were flown in on private charters within 72 hours. Voss Dynamics paid MIT's consulting arm an initial retainer of $600,000 for the privilege, with a daily rate that made even Elena's own board wince when they saw the invoice. Richard Kessler stood at the front of the hangar on the first morning and gave a speech about legacy, precision, and the unparalleled complexity of German engineering. He did not mention that he had personally deleted an internal service bulletin 8 months earlier because it embarrassed him in front of a different client. He did not mention that he had systematically stripped the technical center's institutional memory by pushing out the manufacturer's original American liaison, a quiet man who'd spent 2 decades in that garage and who Richard found, frankly, beneath the image he was trying to build. That man's name was Marcus Webb. And on the first morning of the 50-engineer diagnostic operation, he was 30 miles away, replacing a timing belt on a minivan for a woman who needed it back by 3 so she could pick up her kids. Marcus had not always fixed minivans. For 20 years, he had been the primary test and validation driver for the German manufacturer's Advanced Prototype Division, the man who took unfinished, half-documented machines out onto closed tracks and public roads and found out, often at speeds most people would call reckless, what they could actually survive. He had never had his name on a single patent. He had never appeared in a press release. His job, by design, was to be invisible. The manufacturer's marketing was built entirely around the mythology of German engineers in white coats. And there was no room in that story for an American contractor with grease under his fingernails, however many failures he had personally walked back from the edge of a guardrail. He had helped design half the failsafe systems the Kestrel's platform used back when the platform was still called a project number instead of a car. He had sat in on the sessions where hidden reset protocols were built into obscure corners of the wiring harness. Manual overrides meant for a very specific kind of catastrophic sensor failure, systems so rarely needed that most working engineers went entire careers without touching one. And then, 4 years ago, the manufacturer had decided that human test drivers were an expensive, unpredictable legacy cost in an age of simulation software and automated test rigs. Marcus had been let go, with a severance check and a form letter thanking him for his years of service, a letter that did not once use his name. He had a garage now, 3 bays, a hand-painted sign, and a daughter named Sadie, who was 11 years old and did her homework on a stool in the corner most afternoons because there was nobody else to watch her, and Marcus was not going to apologize to anyone for that. The Kestrel diagnostic effort, by contrast, moved through the hangar like a very expensive, very loud form of theater. The 50 engineers split into teams. They pulled logs. They ran the manufacturer's proprietary diagnostic software, which returned nothing but a generic fault code that translated, roughly, to system halted, cause unknown. They debated whether the issue was electrical or mechanical, with the fervor of men and women who had spent their entire academic careers being told they were right. They built simulations. They flew in a rented dynamometer. On day 3, one team became convinced the issue was a firmware corruption in the engine control unit and spent 31 hours trying to force a manual reflash, an effort that ended when they discovered the ECU had no accessible bootloader port because the manufacturer, in a fit of proprietary paranoia, had physically sealed it at the factory. Richard Kessler attended every morning briefing. He asked pointed questions designed to make it sound as though he understood the answers. He forwarded status updates to Elena Boss that used phrases like converging on root cause and narrowing the hypothesis space, phrases that meant nothing and cost nothing, and bought him another day of not being the man who had let a $5 million car die on his watch. By day 6, the retainer invoices had crossed $2 million. The 50 engineers had produced 400 pages of diagnostic reports, 3 competing theories, and 0 working engines. Elena Voss read every one of those reports personally. She had a habit, inherited from her father, of not trusting a summary she hadn't verified herself. And so she sat in her hotel suite each night going through spreadsheets of sensor readings and simulation outputs, looking for the thing that made the story make sense. It never did. The reports were technically fluent and substantively empty, 400 pages of very smart people describing, in increasingly elaborate language, that they did not know what was wrong. On the morning of day 7, she asked Richard Kessler a direct question in front of his own team. She asked him whether anyone currently on this project had actually worked on the car's original development. Richard told her no such person was necessary, that the engineering fundamentals were universal, that a truly elite mechanical mind didn't need legacy institutional knowledge to solve a well-defined problem. It was a smooth answer. It was also, Elena noted quietly, not actually an answer to the question she had asked. She did not challenge him again that day. But she asked her assistant later that evening to pull the personnel history of the technical center going back 5 years, just to see who used to work there. Marcus Webb's name appeared on that list exactly once, in a termination record, with no explanation attached beyond a checkbox marked role eliminated. Elena would not connect that name to anything meaningful for 3 more days. But she read it, twice the way she read anything. That didn't quite add up, and she remembered it. Day 8 brought the fabrication. Richard Kessler was, by then, feeling the particular kind of pressure that comes from having promised results he could not produce. The MIT team, for all their credentials, had started quietly murmuring among themselves that the fault might not be diagnosable at all, without manufacturer schematics that simply didn't exist in any accessible form. Schematics that had died with the disbanded prototype division. One senior graduate student, a sharp, soft-spoken engineer named Priya Anand, had gone so far as to say it out loud in a status meeting that without the original design team's documentation, they were essentially reverse engineering a black box, and that this could take months, not days. Richard did not want to hear months. Months meant Elena Voss asking why she'd pay $2 million for months. So, Richard did what men like Richard do when the truth becomes inconvenient. He looked for someone to blame who couldn't push back. He remembered vaguely that the technical center's paperwork archive still had old service intake forms from the years before he'd taken over, forms filled out by the previous liaison, the contractor he'd pushed out. He pulled one at random from a file box in a storage room nobody had opened in 3 years. It was an intake form for a different prototype entirely, filed 4 years earlier, describing a fail-safe reset procedure for a sensor fault. Marcus Webb's signature was at the bottom. Richard photographed the form. Then, that evening, in his office, he opened an old, unrelated maintenance log for the Kestrel itself, one of the few paper documents the manufacturer had shipped over with the car. And in the margin, in blue ink chosen to plausibly match an existing pen mark, he wrote a note. The note said that a previous contractor had disabled the factory failsafe during an earlier informal inspection, and that this may be the root cause of the current fault. He did not sign it. He did not need to. He simply left it where Elena's assistant, cataloging the physical documents that had come with the car, would find it. 2 days later, she did. The narrative assembled itself with the ugly efficiency of a story that confirms what someone already wants to believe. Richard presented the note to Elena as a breakthrough. He suggested gently, regretfully, that an unauthorized contractor may have tampered with the vehicle's safety systems at some point in the past, disabling a failsafe that had likely triggered the current shutdown as a protective measure once conditions changed. He said the word liability. He said the word lawsuit. He said, without ever quite saying it directly, that this was not Voss Dynamics' fault, and it was certainly not his. Elena asked who the contractor was. Richard said he'd have to check, which was a lie, because he already knew the name on the intake form, and he already knew exactly which unemployed test driver he intended to feed to this particular fire. It took Richard's team one phone call to track down Marcus Webb's garage. It took Richard exactly one afternoon to decide the cleanest way to close this chapter was to publicly formally blame him on the record in front of the client, so that no one would spend another minute asking why the manufacturer's own technical center hadn't solved this in the first place. He drove out to the garage himself. He did not call ahead. Marcus was under a sedan when Richard's car pulled into the lot, and Sadie was on her stool doing long division, and neither of them looked up right away, because neither of them yet had any reason to think this visit mattered. Richard introduced himself with a title, not a name, the way men do when they want the title to do the intimidating. He told Marcus that his signature had been found on documentation connected to a serious safety failure in a client vehicle, and that Voss Dynamics was, quote, considering its options, and that it would go a great deal easier for everyone if Marcus simply admitted, informally, that he might have made an error 4 years ago that was now catching up with him. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and asked to see the document. Richard, who had not planned for this specific request, showed him a photograph of it on his phone rather than the physical page. Marcus looked at it for 11 seconds. Then he said it wasn't his handwriting in the margin, only his signature at the bottom on a form for a completely different vehicle platform, and that whoever had written that note had done it recently, in a different pen, on a page that had nothing to do with any Kestrel. Richard told him that wasn't how any of the engineers on site had interpreted it. Marcus said the engineers on site hadn't seen the original document, only a photograph, which was the same limitation he was working with, and that if Richard wanted an honest answer, he should bring the physical page to someone who could examine it properly instead of driving out here to threaten a man in front of his kid. Sadie had stopped doing long division. She was watching her father with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read a room before she can read a claw. Richard did not appreciate being corrected in a garage by a man in a stained work jacket. He told Marcus that Voss Dynamics would be documenting this conversation, and that he would be well advised to cooperate rather than make things worse for himself. Then he left. Marcus did not call a lawyer. He did not call the technical center. He finished the timing belt, drove Sadie home, made her dinner, and sat with her while she finished her homework. And if he was quieter than usual that night, she noticed, because she noticed most things about him. But he did not explain it to her, and she did not ask twice. 3 days after that, Richard Kessler stood in front of Elena Voss, the 50 MIT engineers, and a growing pile of invoices, and made the announcement that would define the worst afternoon of his professional life, though he did not know that yet. He told her, in the calm, rehearsed cadence of a man delivering bad news he has already emotionally distanced himself from, that the investigation had identified a probable root cause. A former unauthorized contractor, he explained, had disabled a critical factory failsafe during informal work on an earlier prototype platform related to the Kestrel's lineage, and the current fault was very likely a delayed consequence of that tampering, a protective system finally triggering under new operating conditions. He said the word negligence. He used the phrase chain of custody. He recommended that Voss Dynamics consider legal action against the individual in question, both to recover the cost of the current diagnostic effort and to establish precedent protecting the manufacturer from similar liability in the future. It was a good performance. It would have worked on almost anyone. Elena Voss listened to the entire thing without interrupting, which Richard mistook, fatally, for agreement. Then she asked him a single question. She asked him for the contractor's name. Richard told her, Marcus Webb. Elena did not react visibly, which was itself the first sign that something in the room had shifted, though nobody watching understood it yet. She simply nodded, thanked Richard for the update, and said she wanted 24 hours to consider next steps before any legal action was initiated. Richard, delighted with how smoothly things had gone, agreed immediately. Elena went back to her hotel room that night and pulled the personnel record she'd requested 6 days earlier, the one with Marcus Webb's name on it and the checkbox marked Roll eliminated. She looked at the dates. Marcus Webb's termination had occurred 3 years and 8 months earlier. The document Richard had shown her, the intake form Marcus had allegedly falsified, was dated 4 years and 2 months earlier, which put it squarely within Marcus's period of active employment, not after it, as Richard's framing had implied. She read the fault code from the Kestrel's own onboard log again, the one the 50 engineers had spent a week failing to interpret. And for the first time, she noticed something she had glossed over 6 times before, a secondary code buried beneath the primary system halted flag, one none of the reports had addressed at all, because none of the reports had recognized it as anything other than noise. She picked up her phone and called her assistant. She asked for Marcus Webb's address. She did not tell Richard Kessler she was going. Marcus's garage sat behind his house, a converted 2-car structure with hand-labeled toolboxes, and a workbench swept clean every night before closing, a habit left over from 20 years of being told that a sloppy bay got someone killed eventually. Elena Voss arrived unannounced, in a plain black car with no driver's livery, at 7 in the evening, while Sadie was setting the table for 2. Marcus answered the door in the same work jacket. He recognized her immediately, from the news coverage of the Kestrel's launch, though he did not say so. Elena introduced herself and asked if she could have 10 minutes. Marcus glanced back at Sadie, who was watching from the kitchen with open curiosity, and told Elena she could have 10 minutes if she didn't mind talking, in a garage that smelled like brake cleaner. She didn't mind. She told him without preamble what Richard had claimed. She watched his face while she said it, the way you watch someone's hands more than their words, and she saw something settle into place behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like the quiet, weary recognition of a pattern he'd seen before. Marcus told her the intake form was real. He had filled it out 4 years ago for a completely different platform, describing a legitimate diagnostic reset he'd performed under the direct supervision of the German prototype team. Fully documented, fully authorized, nothing informal about it. He told her he still had his own copies of his old work logs at home, because he had learned over 2 decades of being an invisible contractor to never trust a company to keep his own records straight for him. He went into a back room and came out with a fireproof lockbox. Inside were photocopies of years of signed intake forms, supervisor sign-offs, test logs in his own handwriting, cross-referenced by date. He found the original form Richard had photographed. He handed it to Elena directly, the real page, not a photo of it, and asked her to look at the ink. The signature at the bottom was faded, 4 years old, consistent with the rest of the page. The margin note Richard had shown her did not exist on this copy at all, because Marcus's own archived copy predated whatever had been added to the version currently sitting in the Technical Center storage room. Elena asked him one more question. She asked him if he knew anything about the Kestrel specifically. Marcus said he'd helped build the failsafe architecture for the platform it descended from, back before it had a name, back when it was still project designation, and a stack of unlabeled prototypes in a hangar outside Stuttgart. He said if she wanted, he'd take a look. Not to prove anything to anyone, just because a car that wouldn't start was, to him, still just a car that wouldn't start, and that was a problem he happened to know how to think about. Elena looked at Sadie's math homework on the counter, at the swept workbench, at the neat rows of labeled tools, at a man who had just been shown documentation accusing him of a safety violation and had responded not with outrage, but with a fireproof lockbox of his own careful records. She asked him to come to the hangar the next morning. Marcus told her he had a 9 o'clock break job scheduled for a regular customer, and he wasn't going to cancel on her for anyone, but he could come by at 11. Elena said 11 was fine. The next morning, Richard Kessler stood in front of Elena Voss and the 50 MIT engineers, with a legal memo drafted overnight, ready to formalize the case against Marcus Webb, entirely unaware that the woman he was presenting it to had spent the previous evening in that same man's garage holding physical proof that Richard's version of events was, at best, a deliberate distortion and, at worst, an outright fabrication. At 11 o'clock, Marcus Webb walked into the hangar in his work jacket, carrying his canvas tool roll, and Richard Kessler looked at him the way you look at a stain on a white shirt. He asked Elena, in front of everyone, what this man was doing here. Elena said she'd invited him. Richard said with the particular condescension of a man watching his own narrative slip out of his hands and not yet understanding why, that this was the individual responsible for the safety tampering under discussion, and that his presence here, unsupervised, near the vehicle in question, was frankly a serious concern. Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He set his tool roll down on a workbench, opened it, and asked Elena for permission to open the hood. She gave it. The 50 MIT engineers, several of whom had spent the better part of a week failing to make meaningful progress and were by now deeply skeptical of anyone's ability to solve this problem, watched, with a mixture of professional curiosity and quiet resentment, as a man twice some of their ages leaned into the engine bay of a car they had collectively spent $2 million failing to diagnose. Marcus worked in silence for close to 4 minutes. He traced the wiring harness along a path that existed on no schematic any of the 50 engineers had been given, because the harness routing had been changed late in development by the original prototype team in a modification that had never made it into the manufacturer's official documentation. A modification Marcus knew about only because he had been in the room when they made it. He found what he was looking for behind a small access panel near the firewall, a panel none of the 50 engineers had removed, because nothing in any manual indicated anything was behind it. Inside was a small, unmarked relay housing, roughly the size of a matchbox, with a recessed reset switch sunk half an inch into a narrow channel, designed, Marcus explained, without looking up, to be functionally inaccessible to anyone without the specific tool the manufacturer had never actually manufactured, because the switch had been meant for internal testing only, and was never supposed to survive into a production vehicle at all. He reached into his tool roll and took out a small flathead screwdriver, and from his jacket pocket a bent paperclip, and Priya Anand, the sharp-eyed graduate student who had spent the week quietly suspecting the problem was unsolvable without lost documentation, stepped closer and asked what the switch actually did. Marcus told her it was a hard reset for the vehicle's redundant sensor cluster, a failsafe designed to trip and lock the engine into a protected shutdown state if certain sensors reported conflicting data that the system couldn't reconcile. A rare fault condition meant to prevent a runaway engine scenario during early prototype testing, back when the sensor suite itself was still unreliable. He said the switch was supposed to be permanently disabled before any car left the factory floor for a customer. He said that somewhere in the Kestrel's final assembly, Someone had missed that step, either through an oversight or a shortcut, and the failsafe had remained live, dormant, invisible, until some ordinary sensor drift, the kind every vehicle experiences over time, and normally ignores had finally tripped a threshold nobody expected a production car to ever reach. He used the screwdriver to hold the relay housing steady and the bent end of the paperclip to depress the recessed switch, applying slow, even pressure for what he said needed to be a full 11 seconds. No faster because the reset cycle required the system to confirm the fault had cleared before it would release the lockout. The hangar was silent except for the quiet click of the relay resetting. Marcus withdrew the paperclip, closed the access panel, straightened up, and told Elena she could try the ignition now. Elena Voss walked to the car herself. Richard Kessler stood very still, the legal memo in his hand suddenly feeling like a much heavier document than it had 10 minutes earlier. Elena turned the key. The engine caught immediately, a low, clean roar that filled the hangar and rattled faintly against the metal walls, the sound of $5 million of German engineering doing, finally, the one thing it had been built to do. Nobody clapped. It didn't feel like a moment for clapping. It felt like watching a held breath finally get released. Elena let the engine run for almost a full minute before she killed it, and in that silence afterward, she asked Marcus, in front of Richard and all 50 engineers, how he had known about a switch that existed on no documentation anyone in the hangar had access to. Marcus told her he'd spent 20 years as the manufacturer's primary test and validation driver for exactly this vehicle lineage, and that he'd been in the design meetings where that fail-safe was built, back before the platform had a name, and that he knew where it was, because he had helped decide where to put it. He said the manufacturer had let him go 4 years ago, when they moved to automated simulation testing, and that his name had never appeared on a single document connected to any of it, by design, because the company's story about itself had never had room in it for an American contractor who wasn't wearing the right badge. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you report a fact. Richard Kessler attempted, in the silence that followed, to salvage something. He said this didn't change the question of the falsified intake form, the safety tampering allegation, the liability concern he'd raised days earlier. Elena Voss turned to him and said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, that she had spent the previous evening at Marcus Webb's home and that she had personally reviewed his original signed work logs, records that predated and directly contradicted the version of the document Richard had presented to her, and that she would like Richard to explain, specifically, how a margin note referencing tampering had come to exist on a company document in ink that did not match any corresponding entry in Marcus Webb's own contemporaneous records. Richard said the note must have been added by someone else at the technical center, at some point, for reasons he couldn't speak to. Elena said that was in fact exactly her working theory as well, and that she intended to have the physical document, and Richard's office, and the technical center's document handling procedures over the past 2 weeks, formally examined by an independent forensic auditor before the end of the week. Richard said that seemed like an overreaction to what was in his view a minor documentation ambiguity, now happily resolved by Marcus Webb's timely intervention. Elena said that a $5 million vehicle sitting dead for 9 days, a $2 million consulting bill that produced nothing, and a fabricated allegation against a man with no ability to defend himself against a corporation was not, in her view, a minor ambiguity, and that she would be discussing all 3 with her board this week. She thanked Marcus Webb for his time. She asked if he would be willing to stay through the afternoon to walk the 50 engineers through the actual undocumented architecture of the vehicle so that the manufacturer would, going forward, have at least one complete and accurate record of how the car actually worked. Marcus said he could stay until 3. He had to pick up his daughter. Nobody in that hangar laughed at that the way they might have laughed at it a week earlier. The forensic review took 4 days. It found what Elena had already suspected. The margin note on the maintenance log had been written in a pen sourced from Richard Kessler's own office supply order, using ink chemically distinct from every other entry on the page, added at a point in time that the document's own paper aging placed well after the original log had been created. It found email records showing Richard had accessed the archived intake form the same evening he claimed to have discovered the alleged tampering. a discovery that, according to his own account, should have come as a surprise to him. Sacks. It also found, buried in Richard's internal communications from 18 months earlier, the deleted service bulletin he had quietly suppressed, a bulletin that, had it remained active, would have flagged exactly the kind of undocumented factory oversight that caused the Kestrel's failure in the first place. 20 oversight Richard had chosen not to escalate at the time, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting his technical center didn't fully understand the vehicles it was responsible for. Elena Voss convened a board meeting the following week. Richard Kessler was asked to present a full account of the diagnostic process, unaware that the forensic findings had already been distributed to every member of the board that morning. He gave, essentially, the same speech he had given in the hangar. Legacy, precision, the unparalleled complexity of German engineering. He characterized Marcus Webb's intervention as a fortunate coincidence rather than what it actually was, and he suggested that the documentation irregularities were being overstated by people unfamiliar with how technical archives naturally degrade over time. Iana let him finish. Then she distributed the forensic report to every board member in the room, along with a side-by-side comparison of the ink analysis, the access logs, and the suppressed service bulletin from 18 months earlier. She did not raise her voice either. She simply asked Richard in front of the board whether he still stood by his account. Richard did not have a smooth answer for that. For the first time in the entire affair, he had none at all. He was suspended that afternoon, pending a full review, and terminated 11 days later, a fact that made its way through the technical center faster than any official announcement could have. He left the building on a Tuesday morning, carrying a single box, and nobody in the hangar looked up from their work to watch him go, which was, in its own way, the most complete verdict the place could have delivered. Elena Voss did two things in the weeks that followed. She offered Marcus Webb the newly created position of Senior Technical Liaison for the entire Kestrel program, with a compensation package that would have changed his and Sadie's life in ways he had stopped letting himself imagine years ago. Marcus thought about it for 3 days. Then he told Elena he'd take a version of the job, but not the version she'd offered. He didn't want a corner office at the technical center, and he didn't want to report to whoever replaced Richard. He proposed instead an independent consulting arrangement, one where he worked out of his own garage, kept his existing customers, and came in only when Voss Dynamics needed him, answerable to no one inside the company's management chain, reporting only to Elena directly, with full authority to flag any safety or documentation issue without needing anyone's permission first. Elena asked him why he didn't want the bigger role, the higher title, the office. Marcus told her that the last time he'd been fully inside a company like that, his entire 20 years of work had been erased in a form letter that didn't use his name, and he wasn't interested in trading his garage and his daughter's afternoons for a badge that could be revoked the next time someone decided his kind of knowledge was inconvenient. Elena agreed to every condition without negotiating a single one. She also began, quietly, restructuring the technical center's entire documentation practice, mandating that every undocumented modification made during prototype development be formally logged and cross-referenced before any vehicle left the assembly floor, closing exactly the kind of gap that had nearly gotten someone killed on a state highway at 40 miles an hour. She brought Priya Anand, the sharp graduate student, who had been the only one of the 50 engineers willing to say out loud that they were missing something, onto the technical center's staff permanently, specifically tasked with building an actual functioning archive of institutional knowledge, the kind that should have existed all along. Months later, Elena Voss drove out to Marcus Webb's garage on a quiet Saturday afternoon, not for a diagnostic emergency, but because she happened to be in the area and hadn't seen Sadie's science fair project yet, the one Marcus had mentioned, almost shyly, during their last call about an unrelated sensor calibration issue on a different prototype. Sadie showed her the project, a working model of a redundant sensor system, built, unmistakably, by a kid who had grown up around a man who cared more about things working honestly than things looking impressive. Elena and Marcus sat on the back step of the garage while Sadie went back inside to finish dinner prep, and they didn't talk about the company, or the board, or Richard Kessler, whose name came up rarely now and meant less each time it did. They talked, instead, about nothing in particular. The way people do when the professional reason for knowing each other has quietly become a smaller part of why they keep showing up. Marcus still swept his workbench clean every night before closing. He still did break jobs for regular customers who'd been coming to him for years, and he still turned down every attempt to move his shop somewhere bigger, somewhere more visible, somewhere that would have made him easier for Voss Dynamics to point to in a press release. He didn't need to be visible. He never had. He had spent 20 years being the invisible reason. An entire fleet of prototypes never killed anyone. And he had spent 4 more years being told that invisibility made him disposable. It hadn't. It had just made him hard to see, until the moment someone finally needed the truth badly enough to go looking for the person who actually had it. And when that moment came, he hadn't needed a speech, or a title, or 50 engineers standing behind him. He'd needed a screwdriver, a bent paperclip, and 11 quiet seconds. That had always been enough.